He thought he was untouchable, a billionaire, a man who could manipulate the financial markets with nothing more than a signature. But today, in this courtroom, he was just a defendant, and justice was waiting to be served. New York, a freezing morning. A crowd gathered outside the courthouse, their breath forming misty clouds under the flashing lights of dozens of cameras. Everyone was waiting for the moment the entire nation had been anticipating: the downfall of Vincent Drake. He wasn't just any con man. He was a Wall Street legend, a so-called investment genius, praised for turning everything he touched into gold. But behind the admiration lay a brutal truth. Thousands of families left with nothing, retirees stripped of their life savings, small businesses crumbling overnight. And this morning, he walked into the courtroom as if he were arriving at a cocktail party. The courtroom doors swung open. Vincent Drake stepped in. He moved slowly, clad in a perfectly tailored Italian suit, designer sunglasses masking his cold, calculating eyes. A smirk played on his lips as he passed the crowd. No remorse. No fear. Victims clenched their fists, eyes burning red. An elderly woman, Marjorie, 72, a former teacher who had lost everything, watched him with quiet devastation. But he didn't care. Everyone in the room stood, except Vincent. He remained seated, casually pulling out his phone, scrolling through headlines about himself. Billionaire Vincent Drake faces record-breaking sentence. The biggest financial fraud in U.S. history. Final trial begins. And he laughed. Not a nervous chuckle. Not a humble smile. The kind of laugh that said he still believed the world belonged to him. His lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently, "Vincent, stand up." Now. He shrugged. "This is just a show." Judge Eleanor Carter watched him. She said nothing, but the air in the courtroom thickened. Hundreds of eyes locked onto Vincent. No one breathed. No one moved. Because they all knew. A storm was coming. Today, justice speaks. Stay until the end. You won't want to miss the moment one of the most powerful men in America faces a verdict no one saw coming. And if you believe that no one, no matter how rich or powerful, should be above the law, then like, share, and subscribe now. Because we don't just tell stories. We expose the truth. New York had never been short on scandals. But this trial was unlike any other. From the early morning hours, crowds had gathered outside the federal courthouse, pressing against the security barriers. Signs waved high in the air, voices rose in a chaotic mix of anger and desperation. Reporters squeezed through every gap, gripping their microphones tightly, cameras flashing to capture every second. They knew this wasn't just a trial. It was a battle between justice and unbridled greed. At the center of this media storm was Vincent Drake, a name once spoken with admiration, even reverence. He had been the so-called investment genius, a man who turned millions into billions, luring investors from every corner of the world. But today, he wasn't standing on a stage in an opulent financial conference, dressed in power and prestige. Today, he sat quietly in the defendant's chair. The once confident face now carried a trace of exhaustion, but not a hint of regret. The charges against him were staggering: money laundering, financial fraud, market manipulation. The numbers on paper might have seemed cold and lifeless, but the damage they had inflicted was all too real. Small business owners who had poured their life savings into his funds now had nothing. Retirees who had spent decades saving for their golden years were left with nothing but unpaid bills and an uncertain future. They were here, in this courtroom, eyes red with grief and rage. Some clutched debt notices in their hands, as if they were the last, tangible proof of the betrayal they had suffered. The air inside the courtroom was razor-sharp with tension. The judge, a stern-looking man with a commanding presence, struck his gavel hard against the bench, calling for order. The prosecutor stood, his eyes locking onto the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, today we are not just trying a man. We are putting an entire system on trial. A system that has allowed greed to prey upon the vulnerable." Vincent sat still. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't acknowledge the piercing gazes of those who had once trusted him. Behind him, his defense attorneys whispered hurriedly, preparing arguments, trying to salvage what was left. But the question remained, how do you justify the disappearance of billions from the accounts of innocent people? In the front row of the audience, an elderly woman sat motionless. Her silver hair framed a face etched with sorrow. She clutched a handkerchief in her trembling hands, tears brimming in her eyes as she looked at Vincent. Her husband had died of a heart attack after discovering their life savings had vanished in the financial whirlwind he had orchestrated. She wasn't here just for the verdict. She was here to look into the eyes of the man who had destroyed her life. Does the defendant have anything to say? The judge's voice was cold, unwavering. Vincent lifted his head. A heavy silence hung in the air. Then a smirk, subtle, indecipherable. The entire courtroom held its breath. Was this remorse? Or just another game? Because if there was one thing Vincent Drake had always excelled at, it was manipulation. Vincent Drake, the arrogant tycoon who defied the law. Vincent Drake walked into the courtroom as if it were his personal stage. The expensive black suit clung perfectly to his tall frame, every stitch flawless, not a wrinkle in sight. A pair of dark sunglasses concealed his sharp, calculating eyes, and even as he strode past rows of furious, devastated onlookers, he remained composed, like this was just another business meeting. A smirk flickered across his lips, bold, defiant. "You can't touch me." His victims sat in the front row, their eyes red, their faces lined with pain and anger. They had lost everything, their money, their trust, and in some cases their loved ones. But Vincent didn't care. To him, they were nothing more than pawns in a grand chess game. He didn't fear them. He didn't fear the law, because in his world, the law had never truly reached him. As the judge entered the courtroom, the entire room rose to their feet, a gesture of respect. Except Vincent. He remained seated, unfazed, pulling out his phone as if he were waiting for a delayed flight rather than standing trial for one of the biggest financial scandals in history. He casually scrolled through the headlines, ironically, all about him. The comment of the century faces justice. Vincent Drake, the untouchable, finally brought down. A smirk, a chuckle. His lawyer, a seasoned man with salt and pepper hair, leaned in, whispering with urgency. Vincent put the phone away. "You can't disrespect the judge like this." Vincent barely glanced at him, shrugging lazily. "It's just a show." He said it loud enough for others to hear. A few people in the courtroom turned, their faces twisting in disgust. But Vincent? He didn't care. Above them, Judge Eleanor Carter watched. She said nothing. Her sharp eyes stayed fixed on Vincent, assessing him, reading him. She had seen men like him before. Powerful, arrogant, convinced they were above it all. And she had broken men like him before. Today, it was his turn. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. The prosecutor, a hard-faced man in his 50s, stood up, his gaze unwavering. "Defendant Vincent Drake, do you understand the weight of the crimes you've committed?" Vincent leaned back, arms crossed. Slowly, he removed his sunglasses, revealing a pair of piercing eyes filled with amusement. "Crime." A low chuckle escaped his lips. "Bad investments, bad luck. I can't be responsible for other people's poor decisions." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. A man in the audience shot to his feet, voice trembling with rage. "You stole from my family. You drained our savings and disappeared. My wife, she took her own life because of what you did." Vincent turned, his expression vacant. "No remorse. No sympathy. That's unfortunate." A shrug. "But that's not my fault." The room erupted. Judge Eleanor Carter calmly lifted her gavel and brought it down with a sharp crack against the bench. Silence fell. Her voice was low but carried undeniable authority. "Order in the court." The prosecutor's eyes locked onto Vincent's. "So, in your mind, the hundreds of people who lost everything, the bankruptcies, the ruined lives, the suicides, were all their fault." Vincent leaned forward, placing both hands on the table. The smirk never left his lips. "Everyone makes choices. They chose to trust me. I simply provided an opportunity." Murmurs of disbelief spread through the courtroom. But no matter how much they hated him, Vincent remained untouched. He had always controlled the game. The law, Just another hurdle. Except this time, something felt different. Judge Eleanor Carter remained unmoved by his arrogance. She calmly flipped through a thick file of evidence, her fingers brushing over the documents like she had done this 1,000 times before. Then, she looked up. Her voice was calm, unshaken. Vincent Drake, the evidence is overwhelming. For financial fraud, money laundering, and market manipulation, I find you guilty on all charges. The maximum sentence will be imposed. For the first time, the smirk disappeared. Vincent blinked, as if struggling to process what he had just heard. His entire life, he had always found a way out. Money, connections, loopholes. Not this time. The handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists. The cold metal sent a shiver through him. As the officers pulled him to his feet, he was forced to walk past the very people whose lives he had destroyed. He expected their hatred, but what surprised him was something else. Relief, as if they had just reclaimed something that had been stolen from them. Vincent's gaze darted across the crowd, searching for even a flicker of support. But there was none. No one believed in him anymore. For the first time in his life, Vincent Drake had lost everything. Fraud and its devastating consequences. Vincent Drake wasn't just a con artist. He was a master manipulator. He didn't snatch purses on the street or forge credit cards. No, his crimes were far more insidious. He stole dreams, trust, and entire lives with something far more dangerous: promises. His scheme was built to perfection. He created a web of fake investment funds, marketed as once-in-a-lifetime opportunities for those looking to get rich fast. With his sharp wit, unwavering confidence, and powerful influence, he easily lured in those searching for a path to prosperity. He promised unbelievable returns, backed by fabricated financial reports that made everything seem too good to be true. Investors watched their money multiply, on paper at least. But the truth? The money never grew. Vincent was running a classic Ponzi scheme, using money from new investors to pay off the old ones, masking billions in losses with sophisticated accounting tricks. He hired top financial experts, bribed auditors, and even had politicians quietly backing him. For years, the system ran like a well-oiled machine, and he became a symbol of financial success. They called him a genius investor, a modern-day Warren Buffett. But like every Ponzi scheme, it had a collapse. When Vincent was finally arrested, the world was stunned by the scale of his crimes. Tens of billions of dollars lost. Thousands of people lost everything. Their entire lives swept away by a lie. The victims. One of the hardest-hit victims was Richard Hayes, a 65-year-old retired veteran. After dedicating 3 decades of his life to military service, he had saved every penny to ensure a peaceful retirement. Then he believed in Vincent. He invested everything he had, hoping to leave something behind for his children and grandchildren. But when the scheme collapsed, so did his dreams. With nothing left, he was forced to return to work in a factory, performing back-breaking labor just to survive. At an age when he should have been enjoying the fruits of his sacrifice, he was now working like a young man just starting out. Then there was Lisa Carter, a single mother. She had spent years working tirelessly to care for her chronically ill daughter. Desperate to secure a better future for her child, she placed all her faith in Vincent's promises. When her investment vanished, so did her hope. Unable to afford private medical care, she had to place her daughter in a free care facility, where the conditions were nowhere near what she once provided. Now, every time she visited, she broke down in tears, blaming herself for ever trusting a man like Vincent. And then there were Michael and Sarah Thompson, a young couple who owned a small bakery that had been in their family for 3 generations. Hoping to expand their business, they took a leap of faith and invested in Vincent's fund. They dreamed of turning their family bakery into a household name. Instead, they lost everything. The bakery, their home. From business owners with a bright future, they became bankrupt nobodies, struggling to start over. A courtroom filled with broken lives. Their stories were not unique. There were thousands like them. Lives destroyed, families shattered. And Vincent? He sat there, completely unmoved, showing not a shred of remorse. The courtroom fell silent as an elderly woman took the witness stand. Her hands trembled. Her voice broke as she recounted how she had saved every dollar for over 40 years, only to lose everything to Vincent's lies. She had dreamed of a peaceful retirement, but now she couldn't even afford rent and relied on charity to survive. Tears streamed down her wrinkled cheeks. And then Vincent laughed. A cold, sharp chuckle cut through the air, echoing through the courtroom like a slap in the face. People gasped. One man in the crowd blurted out, "Is this bastard laughing?" The prosecutor clenched his fists. Vincent's own lawyer turned pale. But Vincent? He stretched his arms, let out a yawn, and rolled his shoulders bored, as if he were tired of listening to these sob stories. The storm arrives. Judge Eleanor Carter remained calm, but her eyes, cold as steel. She had made her decision. The courtroom grew still, everyone sensing what was about to come. Vincent still believed he was in control, but this time he had gone too far. And this time, no one was coming to save him. The climax, the game, is over. Vincent Drake had fooled the world, but today, the world was no longer listening. For most of the trial, it seemed like a mere formality, a performance Vincent had rehearsed 1,000 times. He remained composed, detached, as if this was just another game. But what he never anticipated was that the hardest blow would come from those he never imagined would betray him. Midway through the trial, an FBI agent stood up. In his hand, he held a small recording device. His cold gaze swept across the courtroom before he pressed play. A voice filled the room. Vincent's voice. Clear, cold, unapologetic. Just make the numbers look good in the reports. These people are sheep. Our job is to shear them. Silence. A silence so thick, so unnerving, it felt as if the air had been sucked from the room. His victims, the people who had lost everything, sat frozen, eyes wide, horrified. Some clenched their fists, others trembled, lips quivering as they struggled to process what they had just heard. And Vincent? He smirked. No denied. No defense. He simply didn't care. The prosecutor turned to face him, his voice sharp as steel. "Do you have anything to say about this, Mr. Drake?" Vincent stretched his arms, yawned, as if the entire trial bored him. Then he shrugged, his voice dripping with disdain. "Everyone does it. Why single me out?" A ripple of outrage spread through the courtroom. People shook their heads, muttering curses under their breath. The tension threatened to boil over, until a single voice cut through the chaos. "Because the others aren't standing in my courtroom. But you are." Judge Eleanor Carter. Her words were quiet, measured, but they hit like a hammer. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need to rage. The calm finality in her voice was enough to make the entire courtroom hold its breath. And in that moment, Vincent hesitated. He was still smiling, but it was different now. The confidence had faded. For the first time, he saw it. The reality he had refused to believe. This time, he wasn't walking away. The weight of the world pressed down on Vincent Drake. And for the first time in his life, there was no way out. A verdict that shocked the nation. The day of reckoning had finally arrived. The courtroom was packed. Millions across the country were glued to their screens, watching every moment of the trial that had shaken the financial world to its core. The victims, those who had lost everything to Vincent Drake's insatiable greed, sat in silence, hope flickering in their eyes, waiting to see if justice would truly be served. Judge Eleanor Carter maintained her signature poise, her gaze locked on Vincent. A heavy silence stretched across the room. Then she spoke, each word landing like a hammer blow on his fate. "Defendant Vincent Drake, this court sentences you to 40 years in federal prison." A shockwave rippled through the courtroom. 40 years. A sentence unheard of in financial crime history. Fraudsters like Vincent rarely faced severe punishment. Many walked away with just a few years behind bars, still wealthy when they got out. But not this time. There would be no escape. Judge Carter continued. Furthermore, she declared, all of the defendant's assets, including his mansions, yachts, luxury cars, offshore accounts, and high-end investments, will be seized and liquidated to compensate the victims. Gasps filled the air. Vincent, The man who once flaunted his untouchable wealth would not only lose his freedom, he would lose everything. The mask falls. But what shocked everyone most was his reaction. Vincent slammed his fists against the table, his face turning red with rage. For the first time, his carefully constructed mask shattered. He shot to his feet, yelling, "I am Vincent Drake. I can buy this courtroom. I can buy all of you." A chilling silence followed. No one spoke. No one reacted. Judge Carter simply lifted her gavel and brought it down with a single, deliberate crack. Her voice was calm, cold. Try doing that from a prison cell. For a moment, Vincent just stood there, mouth open, words failing him. For the first time in his life, he was powerless. The man who believed himself untouchable was now nothing more than a convicted felon, awaiting transfer to a prison cell. The unexpected moment. Then, something no one expected happened. Someone in the crowd started crying. Then another, and another. Victims, people who had lost everything, began embracing each other, overwhelmed with emotions. Some bowed their heads, whispering prayers. Others clenched their fists, not in anger, but in relief. For the first time in years, they felt something they thought had been stolen from them forever. Justice. A single clap echoed through the room. Then another. And then, the entire courtroom erupted. Not in celebration, not in vengeance, but in liberation. They weren't cheering for Vincent's downfall. They were cheering for what they had reclaimed. Not their money, but their faith in justice. A nation reacts. Outside the courthouse, dozens of news outlets broadcasted live. The news spread like wildfire. On social media, millions reacted to the case, praising Judge Eleanor Carter for delivering a verdict that finally held power accountable. Headlines dominated every major outlet. Vincent Drake, the fall of a financial tyrant. 40 years behind bars, justice has spoken. The fraud empire crumbles. The end of Vincent Drake. And as the world celebrated, Vincent was led away in handcuffs. The cold metal tightened around his wrists. No one called him a financial genius anymore. No one bowed to him. He had nothing left. Only one bitter truth remained. The game was over, and he had lost. The game is over, and life goes on. The day Vincent Drake stepped into federal prison, the world outside kept moving, but this time no one cared about him anymore. Behind bars, he was no longer a power player. No expensive suits, no admiring or fearful glances. Just another inmate in an orange jumpsuit, eating prison food, following rules he couldn't bend to his will. No more calls from lawyers. No more lavish parties. No more penthouse views overlooking the city. Just 4 cold walls and an endless stretch of days. Outside, the people who once called him a genius had moved on. His former associates, the same wealthy businessmen who once shook his hand over million-dollar deals, quietly distanced themselves. Some pretended they never knew him. Others publicly condemned him to protect their own reputations. The media, once obsessed with every move he made, had found new scandals to chase. Bit by bit, the name Vincent Drake faded from the headlines. He once believed he was untouchable. But now, the world was forgetting him. New beginnings, even if imperfect. For his victims, those who had suffered the most, there was finally a chance to rebuild. Some received a fraction of their stolen wealth from the seized assets. It couldn't undo the damage, but it was enough to help them stand again. Richard Hayes, the 65-year-old veteran, finally retired for good, never again having to work in a factory just to survive. Lisa Carter, the single mother, could now afford the private hospital her sick daughter desperately needed. Michael and Sarah Thompson, the young couple who lost their family bakery, used the small compensation they received to open a tiny cafe. It wasn't grand. It wasn't what they had dreamed of, but it was a fresh start. Yet, not everyone had a chance to recover. Some had lost too much. Their homes, their families, their trust in people. They would never return to their old lives. But they had one thing they never had before: justice. They knew that the man who stole their futures was now powerless, penniless, and locked away. He could never hurt anyone again. A message from a child. A few weeks after the trial, a small letter arrived at Judge Eleanor Carter's office. It was written by a 10-year-old girl, the daughter of one of Vincent's victims. The child's handwriting filled the lines of a pink piece of paper. Dear Judge Carter, I don't understand much about the law, but I know that a lot of people cried because of Mr. Vincent. My mom cried too. I used to think justice was just in movies, that rich people always win. But then I saw you weren't afraid of him. I saw everyone clap. I think that's justice. Thank you for teaching me that justice isn't just a dream. It's real. Judge Carter read the letter in silence. She had ruled on countless cases, passed many sentences. But perhaps no thank you had ever meant more. Life moves forward. Outside the prison walls, life continued. The world had shed the shadow of Vincent Drake, and for his victims, tomorrow was no longer as dark as before. And Vincent? He sat in his tiny prison cell, staring at a blank wall. No phone, no news reports about him, no one calling his name. For the first time in his life, he was truly alone. And the world? It had already moved on.